Hey everyone, in this video we're going to go over how Redux Saga works, how we can connect it with our existing Redux application, and how we can make API calls and store that API data in our Redux store using Redux Saga. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you know that I've sort of been alluding to Redux Saga quite a bit in the past, and anytime we call an API, I always say that this is one of the proper ways to do it. And I still stand by that, and I think Redux Saga, while it can be a bit daunting at first, can be one of the best tools you could possibly learn when it comes to the React and Redux toolkit. So before I get started, I just want to say thank you all for your support on this series. I couldn't be happier with the amount of responses I've received from you guys and all the feedback, and I just gotta say thank you so much, and I'm really excited to keep pumping these videos out. And yeah, if you find value in this video, please consider liking, leaving a comment, subscribing. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm to get these videos out there. So without any further ado, let's just jump straight in. So in this example, essentially what we're going to do is going to be just calling a API with our Redux Saga and storing the value, the response that we get back from that API inside of one of our reducers. And if you're not familiar with how to set up React and stuff like that, or what a reducer is, make sure you check out my previous video, which is all about Redux and how to set it up, because we are going to actually be building on that code. And what I want to say is, if you read the Redux Saga documentation, you'll see that it's actually quite concise, and it's not the easiest to understand. They sort of put everything into one file, but I want to help break that down for you so that not only will it be more clean when you code it yourself and a bit more scalable, but easier to understand as well. So as you can see from this diagram that I have here, pretty much this is how Redux Saga will work with Redux. First of all, inside of your component, whenever you want to do something, you will dispatch a Redux action. This is just going to be a regular Redux action, just like the ones that we coded in the last video. The only difference is when you dispatch that Redux action, instead of having a reducer in the actual Redux store that will handle that action and sort of catch it, like we did before with the increment and decrement for our counters, instead, we will have something called a watcher saga, and that watcher saga will watch for any Redux actions that are dispatched and map it to its own Redux Saga functions. So pretty much the reason Redux works so well with other libraries is because whenever you dispatch an action in React, you're not only dispatching it for Redux, but all the things that connect with Redux can also use it, such as Redux Saga. And once Redux Saga catches that action, it will pretty much map it using this thing called the Watcher Saga to the appropriate handler function that will actually make the API request, and that handler function will then dispatch another Redux action that will store the data back in our Redux store. So to give this a proper example, what we're going to be doing in today's example is a very simple API request that's just going to get the information for a user. So our component is going to dispatch, for example, a get user function, action. That action will then hit the Watcher Saga. The Watcher Saga will then call something called, for example, handle get user. That handler function will then call a request function called, let's say for example, do get user, or let's say like request get user, which will actually make the Axios API call. And if you remember from my other videos, let me zoom in a bit here. You can see here that before, for example, when we wanted to hit an API, we would be using a useEffect inside of the actual component that would get the that would use Axios to call the API. But instead, Axios is going to be calling the API from a request function in a request file that we have. Once that request function gets the data, it's going to return it back to the handler function, and that handler function is pretty much just going to dispatch something that's going to be like, set user, that will set the user object in our Redux store that will allow us to access that user function anywhere in our React application, no matter what component it is. And that's really the difference between using an API request in just a component with a useEffect and using it with Redux Sagas. It allows you to streamline the process. It allows it to asynchronously happen without blocking the component or having anything else within the actual component dependent on it. And it'll allow you to more easily sort of structure your API calls, assuming that you're making a full-on application. Now, if you don't understand this entire flow just yet, don't worry. It looks a lot more complicated because I use a lot of different colors and stuff like that, but we will be going step by step, and it will be a lot easier for you to understand once we actually get into the entire application and the entire code. Now, the first thing we have to do is we have to set up our endpoint. And in the next video, I'm going to be showing you how to do that with Express. But for this video, we're going to be using the same tool we used for one of our previous videos called jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. And I love this because it's pretty much just a website with a bunch of fake data that you can hit. Now, they already have a user's endpoint, but that's going to return an array of users. And I want to return a single user as if you're authenticating. Now, what I'm going to show you how to do is how to create your own fake data. So if you wanted to try this out on your own, you'd be able to do that. So once you're on the website, and I'll have the link of this in the description, scroll down to the bottom where it says use your own data, and I'll zoom in a bit. And then click the link in the description. Now, over here, it'll pretty much say that all you have to do in order to create your own server with your own data is first, just go to the repo. So, whoops. Go to this repo, so github.com/typecode/demo. I'll have a link for this as well. Fork the repository. So you can go ahead and fork the repository, and then once you fork the repository to your GitHub, you can click the db.json, and you can see here I've already edited it, and let me show you what the previous one used to look like. The previous one used to look like this, just some dummy data. So what you can go ahead and do in that dummy data is once you go inside of that db.json file, you can go ahead and click edit, and you can put whatever JSON you want here. So the JSON I have is this user object, and pretty much the user will just have an ID, a name. I can maybe add maybe I'll call this first name. Maybe I can add last name, which would be Sistili. And pretty much that's about it. So I'm just going to commit these changes, and bam, I now have my own fake, quote, fake endpoint. And the way you access it is pretty much just by visiting this URL. So as you can see, it's just myjsonserver.typecode.com / your GitHub username and then the repo. So my GitHub username is A to the Y, and this repo is called /demo. So I'm gonna go ahead and go to there. So A to the Y and then demo. And then you can see here it generates a nice little UI where you can see, the available resources, and I'm going to click on that user object I wrote, and bam, here is the endpoint that I can hit for my user data that I want. So just a small little trick I thought I would teach you guys. It's really helpful when you're practicing and setting up new projects. So now that we have the endpoint we want to hit, let's go ahead and look into setting up Redux Saga. So as per the documentation, the first thing you want to do is make sure you npm I Redux Saga. And what we're going to do is, because we're using Code Sandbox, I'm just going to go ahead in the dependency list, type in Redux Saga, bam, and it installs. If you are coding this on VS Code, like most development happens, you can just type npm I Redux Saga into your terminal, the same way you install any npm library, and it'll install it for you. Now, the next thing that the documentation says to do is you have to have something called a saga.js, and then you have to connect your Redux store to Redux Saga. So let's look at the first thing. The first thing is they essentially, in their saga.js, have a bunch of different things. So number one is they have the actual handler, which is going to call the API. Number two is they have the watcher saga, which takes every instance of the user fetch requested action and will call that fetch user function that we saw above. And the third thing is they sort of teach you how to, alternatively, if you don't want to use this takeEvery keyword, they use takeLatest. And I'll explain what takeEvery and takeLatest is. But essentially, all you have to know is that's what they are doing. So they break it down into a handler and into a watcher. And then below that, they will show you how to actually set up Redux Saga so it is integrated with your Redux store. So let's go ahead and do that first. So let's go into our Redux folder where we have our configure store file, and you might have remembered this file. So actually the first thing I want to do is create a new reducer for the actual data that we're going to get back. So let's go ahead into Dux and let's call this user.js. We don't want to store the same thing that we have in counter because we're storing different data and we sort of want to organize it in the Dux method. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste what I have for that counter stuff. So the two actions we're going to have is get user, and that's going to be get user. And then we're going to also have set user, because those are the two things that we want to pretty much do. We want to dispatch get user from our component, and then we want to dispatch set user once we have gotten the user data and we want to store it. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create the functions for it. So pretty much just get user. Now usually you would, for example, if you're getting a user, you might pass in the user ID or anything like that. Since this is just a very basic endpoint that we're trying to hit just to illustrate how Redux Saga works, we're going to leave pretty much that as blank. But in the next video, when we're actually using an express server to get all this data, we're going to have a real example in there. Now the next thing we're going to do is set up our set user function. And there we go. So whenever I dispatch an action that does get user, it will dispatch an action of type get user, and the same for set user, which is going to be very important for the next step. But before that, in our initial state, let's just set the user to undefined. And then down here, we don't really need an action for get user because the Watcher Saga and Redux Saga is going to handle the get user stuff. All we need to do is handle the set user case. And in the set user case, it's going to be pretty simple. All we're going to do is we're going to go ahead. Oh, and in set user, because we are getting a user back from our endpoint, we are going to be calling this action with a parameter that is the actual user that we are getting back, the user object that the API is returning. So we're just going to do that, and then we're going to say the user is user, but a shorthand, if you're in an object naming the variable the same thing as you're setting it to, you can just go ahead and type in user once and it'll set that. So we're going to handle this set user action, we're going to go ahead and destructure the user from our action. And then we're going to set the state to be the same thing that it already is. Even though we only have user in the state, it's still good practice to do that. And I talked about it, I think, in the last video. But we're going to do that, except the user is now going to be the the user object in our state is going to be the user that we are getting back from our action. Except, like I said, if you're setting something in an object and it has the same name, you could just go ahead and set it like that. So now that we have that, our reducer is all set up, and we're going to go ahead and over here import our new reducer. So we're going to import we're going to call it user reducer, and we're going to import it from duck/user, and then we're going to say user is our user reducer. So this has nothing to do with sagas yet. We're still just setting up our second reducer. And we're adding it here. So now our Redux is completely set up with the new reducer. Now let's go ahead and set up the actual Redux Saga side of things. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go ahead and import something called the create saga middleware from Redux Saga. And this is pretty much what we're going to use, and that's just going to go ahead and create going to be the thing that we actually create the Redux Saga from. It's pretty much just an initialization function that gets exported from Redux Saga. So you don't have to worry too much about that. So we're going to call that initialization function, and we can go ahead and save it. So const saga middleware equals create saga middleware. And then the next thing we're going to do is usually when it comes to Redux, you might have a couple of different middlewares, and I plan on making a video in the future about the different middlewares you can have. So what I like to do is create an array of all the middlewares you want for Redux Saga. So for example, middleware, middleware is going to be equal to array, and right now we only have the Saga middleware, so we're just going to keep the array limited to that. But in the future, as you add on more reducer middlewares, Redux middlewares like Redux Logger, for example, you can add them to this array. Now, the last thing we're going to do is pretty much over here, we created the store and we just passed in the reducer. But what we didn't actually do is pass in any actual arrays for middlewares that we want in there as well. So what we can do is up here in our Redux, we can also import something called apply middleware. And in the third parameter, so the second parameter is just going to be an enhancer, and we don't have any enhancers right now, and I'll talk about enhancers later. But we are going to add our middleware, so we're going to call the apply middleware, and we're going to pass in, we're going to pretty much spread all the middlewares that we added in here. Essentially, all we're doing now is we're saying, okay, when we create Redux, I want to create Redux the same way we've been doing before with all the different reducers we have, but I also want to add a middleware, and that middleware is going to be Redux Saga. And I want it so that our middleware, Redux Saga, will actually listen to anything that, any dispatches that we make through Redux. And that sounds a bit complicated, but once you see how it works, it'll be a lot easier. So the last thing we have to do in this file is we're pretty much just going to run our Watcher Saga. So Watcher Saga. And the Watcher Saga is something that runs constantly in the background, and it listens for any Redux actions. Like I said before, it'll listen for any Redux actions so that it can map it to their handlers. Whoops. So before we can actually run it, we have to create it. So let's go ahead and create a new directory for our sagas. So we can call this, sagas, for example. And on the top level, I'm going to create something called a root saga. And this root saga is where I like to put my Watcher Saga and all that good stuff in there. So essentially what you want to do is we can go ahead and import a couple of things from Redux Saga. So first thing, we're going to import takeLatest from Redux Saga /effects. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to export a function. Now, with this function and most of the functions that are within the Redux Saga ecosystem are what are known as generator functions. So when you have a generator function in JavaScript, I won't go too into detail. They just allow you to do asynchronous things a bit easier, and there's a lot of other benefits when it comes to generator functions. However, I've never used one outside of the Redux Saga ecosystem. So for just learning Redux Saga purposes, we're just going to sort of go over the basic syntaxes. So the first thing is when you declare the function, you put a little star after it. And now we're going to name our function. Let's call it the Watcher Saga. Now in this Watcher Saga, what we want to do is two things. Well, first of all, this is going to be where we look for any actions that have been dispatched by our Redux store, and we map it to the handler functions that will actually call the requests that make the API calls. So before we do that, now that we just have the Watcher Saga set up, what we can do is we can go ahead into configure store, and we can call saga middleware.run on it. So saga middleware.run, and then we can pass in our Watcher Saga that we have imported from here. And pretty much that's just going to set up a listener. So when we call this, this whole file gets called at the beginning of the application's lifecycle, and it'll just be like, okay, we want whatever is in this generator function to just constantly be running in the background, listening for any Redux actions that are going to be dispatched. Now, the next thing I like to do is in my sagas, I like to create a new file for the requests, and I like to create a new file for the handlers. And let's go ahead and look at the request first. So I like to name the files the same as our reducer. So for example, we're going to store all the requests that have to do with users in this file. So we're going to call it user.js as well. And now in this request file, what we can go ahead and do is, first of all, just like any other API request, we're going to go ahead and import Axios. And next thing we're going to do is we're just going to export a function that just makes the API call. So we're going to export a function, and that function is, let's call it like request get user. And in this, we're not taking any parameters, we're just making a simple API request. And what we're going to do is return axios.request. And if you remember from my video, it's pretty much just going to be the same as this. So axios.request, except we're not actually going to pass in, we're not actually going to have a .then function. We're going to actually pass in the request as a map and have it return the promise for that request, because we're going to be asynchronously calling this with a yield on the handler side. And that might sound a bit confusing, but you'll see what I mean in just a second. So when you call axios.request and pass in sort of an object, what you do is you first pass in the method. So in this case, we're making a get request. So the method is going to be a simple get. You pass in the URL that you want to hit. So if I find, where was it? Over here. So this is, this is the URL we're going to hit, the URL of the JSON server that we set up. And pretty much if you had any other parameters, like for example, if you were calling this with authentication, which we're going to cover in a far greater video, you would use something called with credentials. If you're making a post request, you might add data and stuff like that. All of that stuff we don't really need. All we need right now is to say that we're making a get request and the did I say user? Sorry, that should be URL. We're making a get request and the URL for that get request is this, and that's it. So that's our entire request. Now let's go into the handler. The handler is sort of what connects the root saga to the actual request. And what this handler is going to be doing, we're going to call it user.js as well, because this is going to be the handler for anything that has to do with the actual root saga. So what this is going to do is it's pretty much going to be like, okay, I want to call this request function and I want to store the data in our Redux store. So the first thing we are going to do is let's import call and put from Redux Saga /effects. And the next thing we are going to do is we're going to create a function. It's going to be a generator function as well. And let's say, for example, like handle get user. And in this handle, get user, we can go ahead and essentially take in the action, because when we call a Redux action, when we dispatch a Redux action, all that data that comes from it is going to be inside of there. But because we are getting the user and we're not taking in any parameters from this action, we don't actually need it. So we can delete that if we want. I'm going to leave it just for demonstration purposes. Now, the next thing we can do is we can wrap our call around in a try catch. So we can say response to our API request is going to be yield, which is sort of like await if you've ever done await, but it pretty much says, because most API requests are asynchronous, it pretty much says we are going to wait for this call to finish before we move on. And what are we going to call? This call is a keyword from Redux Saga. We're going to call that request that we just set up. Request get user. We're going to pass in that function. And let's go ahead and just make it catch with an error. And let's console.log the error here. So if it makes an error, for now, basic error catching, we're just going to console log the error, nothing too crazy. And so now we can do something like, for example, we can say, okay, our data, the data that is coming back is going to be equal to the response. And we know that the data that is coming back here, the data that is coming back here is going to be that user object. So now the final thing we can do is number one, we've made the request, and number two, we've gotten the data out of the request, and now number three, we want to store that data inside of our actual reducer. And the way we do that, if we go back to our reducer, as we can see here, we created a set user action that once you dispatch that set user action, it'll set the action over here into our reducer store. So let's go ahead and give a, so the way you do that is you call yield put, and then you pretty much call the set user action, and then you pass in whatever that user is. So I know that sounded a bit complex, and then the last step is to pretty much connect the actual action of getting user with this handler function, because this handler function is what's doing everything, right? If you remember for the diagram, it's pretty much making the request, and then once it gets the request, it's calling that set user function back to store the data that we are getting from the request. So the way we connect the get user action from our reducer to this handle get user action in our Redux Saga handler is through our root saga, our watcher saga. So what we can go ahead and do in this file is we can essentially call the yield takeLatest, and then we connect the two together. So we connect the get user action with the handle get user function. And this get user, we just import it from our Redux store. Just like that. Now, what is going to happen? Oops, I need to install the dependency Axios. Don't forget about that. Okay, so now what is going to happen here? Let's walk through the flow before we actually run this code. When a get user action is dispatched, our watcher saga will take that action and call get user. That get user will then call our request get user, which will make a get request to this endpoint and return will return data. We will then take that data, and yield put is Redux Saga's way of dispatching a Redux action. It will dispatch a Redux action that will set the user to be whatever the data that we got back from the endpoint was. And if we look at our user object, pretty much our user will just be that. So let's go ahead and try this out. Let's just go into our app.js. Let's create, so the same way we created a useEffect to call this here, we can go ahead and create another useEffect. Let's go ahead and import that from React. And instead of calling Axios, all we're going to do is we're going to dispatch an action. And if you remember, to dispatch an action, simply what we're going to do is we're going to create our dispatch function using the useDispatch hook from Redux. All right, and in here, all we're doing is we're going to call dispatch get user, just like that. Oops. Now, what is going to happen here is as soon as the application is rendered, we are essentially, and React might complain and say, for example, in this little array, since we're using a dispatch function, it's technically a dependency for this useEffect. You can go ahead and add that to the useEffect dependency array. It's not going to make a difference because this dispatch is not going to be changing anytime soon. So this useEffect will still run the first time that the component is rendered. But anyways, so let's go ahead and see what is going on here. Let's see if we can get the user object from our reducer. And if you don't remember how to get that, essentially all you have to do in order to get a a Redux variable out of the store is you essentially just use the useSelector hook. So in this case, we want to get the user object, and that is coming from the user reducer. So instead of having the count for the count reducer, we do it like this, and we take it from the user reducer, and we're taking the user object from the user reducer. So now we can go ahead and let's console.log user. So what I would expect to happen here is, number one, first I would expect this user object to be undefined, because this is going to run before this API request finishes. But then after it is undefined, it should be the data, this data that we are getting from here. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So we get an error here that says takeLatest requires a pattern or a channel. And if we look at this, essentially we are importing getUser from DuxUser, but I realize I forgot to actually export that that constant. So all we have to do is export it over here, and we will see that there we go. The first time it runs, and sorry if you can't see the console too clearly, but the first time it runs, we get an undefined for user, but then we actually end up getting the user object from our reducer, which is amazing. That means the request went through and it all worked. And if you're wondering what that takeLatest actually means, so there's a couple of these, and the Redux Saga documentation actually touched upon them. So for example, there's an takeEvery and takeLatest. takeLatest, what that means is when you dispatch a getUser call, it will, let's say for example, you dispatch 2 getUser calls one after another. It would, if the first request was not done yet, if the first getUser request wasn't done yet, and the second getUser request was called, it would simply cancel the first one and take the latest of it. So if you have, for example, an API request that for whatever reason repeats itself before it actually finishes, takeLatest would make it so that only one of them will actually get completed. But if you, for example, use takeEvery instead, that means every time the API request is called, every time that action is dispatched for getUser, even if the previous one didn't finish yet, it will create a separate thread and asynchronously call the endpoint again. So for example, if we were to call this endpoint a bunch of times, depending on how long it takes, so let's say for example, let's dispatch another getUser. You would see here that if I go ahead and refresh it, we are setting the user twice now, because every time we dispatch that getUser action, because we are using takeEvery, it's going to not cancel it if it was called twice in succession. But if we switch this back to takeLatest, there we go. If we switch this back to takeLatest, you'll see here that even though we're calling the API twice, because it doesn't resolve and finish before the second request is done, it will only finish and set the actual data once. So that's sort of the difference between takeEvery and takeLatest. And there's a whole bunch of these takes. There's like for example, there's like a take leading, a take maybe if you want to add some logic. There's a whole bunch of them. But for, just learning purposes, we're just worried about the takeLatest. And now that we have the data, we could do whatever we want with it. For example, like I could go ahead and dispatch I don't know, I could const I can be like h1 hello, and then user dot first name or whatever, first name, and when it first renders it'll be undefined, so I can be I can add some conditional logic like what we did in the first couple of videos in this series, where if the user is undefined, it's not going to display hello. But for example here, if I refresh it, you'll see here it doesn't display it until the request actually resolves and my name is there. But yeah, that is pretty much it for Redux Saga. To recap the flow of things now that we have everything completely done, let me make the code as big as possible. The first thing we do is we dispatch a getUser action. And we set up our Redux Saga so that it watches for any actions that gets dispatched by Redux within one of our components. And when it does, this watcher Saga will look out for specific actions and map it to its handler functions. Those handler functions will then call our request function that makes the API request, then returns the data to our handler function, which will then set that data from the API request back into our actual Redux store, which we can then access in any component of our application. And that is pretty much the TLDR of what Redux Saga is doing. In our next video, we're going to be going over setting up an actual Express server and actually connecting to that Express server using Redux Saga and all locally. So we might also in the video after that throw in some more complex requests so you can see how the functionality of Redux and Redux Saga and Axios sort of builds on as your application gets more complex. So like I said, if you found value in this video, please consider leaving a comment. It really helps get these videos out there to more and more people with the YouTube algorithm, and subscribing and turning those notifications on so you get notified when I put each one of these videos out. Thanks for watching, and I hope you're all staying safe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.